Here's talking about the self. We're going to talk about the self and living in multicultural worlds because we live in a multicultural world. Even if you live on the Navajo Nation, because if you ever go off the reservation to shop, then you're dealing with a multicultural world. You may be dealing with a unicultural world on the Navajo Nation. Probably not, because you're interacting. Well, you're interacting with me, and I represent another culture. And then if you ever shop in Gallup or Flagstaff or wherever, then you're dealing with a multicultural world. So let's talk about the self and personality. First thing we're going to talk about is the 20 statements test. This is kind of an interesting test. It's got two questions, but there are 10 of each. Who am I, or I am, and you have to answer that question. And you have to write down 20 things about yourself. Okay, so that's the deal. And I've given this 20 statements test to students when I was at Ashford University. And it was really kind of fascinating. Most of them couldn't come up with 20 things to say about themselves. But that's just the way it works, I guess. The test takes the form of a survey with respondents asked to give up to 20 responses to the prompts, who am I or I am. It is not mandatory that respondents give 20 answers, but I think the least I got was 7 and the most I got was 13. So a lot of people can't come up with 20 things to say about themselves. The test usually only takes a few minutes. I think I gave them 5 or 6 minutes to take to do it, but they all laid down their pencils after a couple minutes. Does not take very long. The test is unusual in utilizing an open question methodology, making coding non-straightforward. And I left the T out of straightforward. Kuhn in 1960 has stated that responses to the 20 statements test should be grouped into 5 categories: social groups and classifications, ideological beliefs, interests, ambitions, and self-evaluations. And there it is. Who am I and I am? Those are the questions. The 20 statements test is one of the most widely used cross-cultural psychological measures. Americans most often mention personal traits, attitudes, and abilities, which accounted for about 48% of their self-description. The American pattern is similar to many other Western cultures, such as Australia, Britain, Sweden, and Canada. And for some reason, the reason I put this picture in here is because the whole fishy lip kissy kissy thing that people do when they take selfies, that's part of this whole attitude of self. When other cultural groups are given the same measure, the results are very much different. The Maasai and Samburu of Kenya had only 2% of their self-descriptions reflect personal characteristics. 60% of their description encompassed their social membership and roles. The Maasai and Samburu pattern of a greater emphasis on roles and memberships appears in cultures from much of the rest of the world, and these cultural differences are already evident among kindergarten children on the Cook Islands, the Malaysians, the Chinese, the Native Americans, other Africans, Puerto Ricans, Indians, Japanese. These are people from the Cook Islands. This is what people from the Cook Islands look like. These are kindergarten students from the Cook Islands, or elementary students, I guess. A Danish study by Ma et al. In 2012 looked at functional MRIs when participants were evaluating personal characteristics. The Danish participants showed no difference in their functional MRIs when they considered their social roles or their personal characteristics. Both involve the medial prefrontal cortex, which is typically activated in self-judgments. When the researchers performed the same functional MRIs on Chinese participants, their medial prefrontal cortex was only activated when they were considering personal characteristics. When the Chinese thought of their social roles, their temporal parietal function was activated. This is a region that more typically is involved in understanding other people's beliefs. So when they're talking about social roles, as far as the Danish were concerned, it was about the same. It activated that part of your brain when you think about yourself. But for the Chinese, when they thought of their social roles, it was the area that they equated their social roles. They allowed other people to equate their social roles. What would this person think? What would this person do? In Denmark, individualistic country, you got a totally different area of the brain that was activated. Ma et al. In 2012 suggests that the Chinese participants were more likely thinking about other people's beliefs when they thought about their social roles. Though we are all individuals, humans are also a highly social species. Social interaction is a continuous balancing act between focusing on our differences and seeking our connection with others. Now, if you look at this picture and you say, oh, those are Chinese guys, then you would be incorrect. Those are Koreans. All these people are Koreans, and actually, that's the same face put on a bunch of different bodies. So it's the same person over and over and over again. But he is Korean, the artist that made that picture. Marcus and Kitayama first identified the independent view of the self in 1991. Independent individuals experience their identities as largely distinct from their relationships. Independent individuals are self-defining. Their attitudes, their personality traits, their preferences, opinions, abilities, and individual qualities. The self's experiences are rather stable and does not change much from situation to situation. The independent view of self is experienced as self-contained and exists as a relatively coherent and inviolate entity. Relationships vary and are fluid as individuals tend to be closer to close relations than distant ones. In other words, you feel closer probably to your grandparents than to your great uncle that lives in Alaska. Individuals with independent identities still feel much closer to in-group than out-group members. However, they do not view them in fundamentally distinct ways. The main bifurcation is between self and non-self, and both in-group and out-group members are non-selves. Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 also identified the interdependent self. The self overlaps quite a bit with an individual's significant relationships. Interdependent individuals are closely connected with others and are not experienced as distinct, unique entities. Interdependent entities are grounded in their relationships with others. Relationships come in a variety of forms, and they require people to take on particular roles such as father, student, friend, lover, daughter, that govern how they feel and behave toward their relationship partners. The identity of the interdependent individual is experienced as somewhat fluid in different situations. Depending on the situation and the role that the person occupies in that situation, the person's experience of their self will vary accordingly. And a good example of that is the way you act in your own house and the way you act around your parents. You probably act as if you were a child. Well, probably not that extreme, but you act differently around your parents than you do around an older person that you don't really know very well. You act differently around your kids than you do around other people's kids. These are just examples. You don't act the same way all the time. So when you're with your spouse, you may act one way. When you're with an individual that isn't your spouse, you probably act a little bit differently than you would around your spouse. Relationships with one's in-group members are self-defining for those with interdependent selves. Thus, the people in the in-group assume considerable importance. People do not easily become in-group members, nor do close relationships easily dissipate into out-group relations. And here are 3 people dressed as Batman and 1 person dressed as Spider-Man. In 2007, Zhu, Zhang, Fan, and Han conducted an interesting functional MRI experiment on Western and Chinese participants. They asked the participants whether select trait adjectives characterized themselves or their mothers. Now, this is really kind of fascinating. Westerners showed different regions of the brain activation, suggesting that they represent themselves and their mothers in distinct ways. When the Chinese were evaluating themselves or their mothers, they showed activation patterns in the same regions of the two tasks, the medial prefrontal cortex, and an area linked with self representations. In other words, they thought of themselves as an extension of their mother. Independent selves have a number of close relationships with members of their in-group. However, these relationships are less self-defining than are the corresponding relationships of those with more interdependent selves. Interdependent selves identify more strongly with their in-group, while independent selves have a more permeable relationship. Because in-group relations are so critical for self-definition for people in more interdependent cultures, and because they serve to direct appropriate behaviors, it is especially necessary to identify those with whom one has such significant relationships. Obligations to others are an important part of in-group relations among interdependent people, so it is of vital importance for them to distinguish those toward whom they have obligations from those they do not. Becoming a member of an interdependent individual's in-group is thus a rather substantial accomplishment, and such relationships should be entered cautiously. Now, there's a reason why I have this picture here. This is from a movie called A Clockwork Orange, and this was a group. It's a futuristic dystopian view of what a life's going to be like in the future. But as you can see, these guys are dressed in long underwear. They've got a jock strap with a cup in it along their crotch. These are combat boots, and they all wear some interesting hats. And they go around bullying people. They are an in-group, a curious in-group. In the movie, it's really kind of a fascinating movie. I don't know if you should watch it or not. There's some nudity in it, and there's a rape scene in it, and it's fairly raw. But it's talking about it's a fairly dystopian view of what's going to happen in the future. People go to drug bars where they drink milk infused with different drugs that make them feel different ways. A more independent person is likely to perceive themselves as existing and functioning separately from the social environment. The environment is more tangential to the independent person's identity. Relationships can be formed or broken without having a large impact on the independent person's identity. People with independent selves are more willing to form new relationships, maintain larger networks of relationships, and be less distressed should any of these relationships fade away over time. For independent persons, in-groups and out-groups are less consequential to self-construction. And a good example of that would be people in the military. People in the military move every 2 or 3 years. So you develop these friendships, and they may be real intense friendships while you're there, but then you go this way, and your friend goes in a totally different direction. And because of that, these relationships are fairly tangential. In other words, they're really important for the moment, and as soon as it's over with, then you don't really think about it anymore, because the probability that you'll ever see that person again is fairly remote. Now, when I was in the military, of course, communication was not as easy as it is today. Now, of course, you can text people, you have cell phones. Back when I was in the military, telephones were attached to the wall, and every time you called somebody, it was long distance. And because of that, and because it was so expensive to communicate with people, communication was less common. Let's say that it was less common. So you didn't stay in touch with people, and the reason you didn't do that is because as a military member, you weren't being paid all that well, and maintaining these connections with people was difficult. Now, if you ever did run into that person, they were a really good friend of yours from the past, and of course, that was really cool. But the probability of running into people was not that high. As a matter of fact, I don't can't think of anybody that I ran into more. Yes, I do. Um, when I was stationed at Lubbock and at Reese Air Force Base, one of the supply sergeants, I knew him, and then when we shipped out to uh, I shipped out to Ramstein, and my wife shipped out to Zweibrücken, and we were able to live together on Zweibrücken. But her supply sergeant was the same guy, and he lived across the street from us. So that friendship, and that was the only one I can think of the only person I ever ran into again was Brian. Okay, so there you go. Anyway, independent. So military people are fairly have to be independent people because they're not in one place for very long. There is convergent evidence of heightened distinction between in-groups and out-groups among those who are more interdependent. Collectivistic cultures, such as the Japanese, richly describe this pronounced difference in behavior between contexts involving in-groups, uchi, and those involving out-groups, soto. So your uchi are the people that you are close to, that's your in-group, and the people that you're not part of. This is a Sailor Moon outfit, by the way. These are Japanese girls wearing Sailor Moon outfits. And the people that are not in your group, the people that don't dress like Sailor Moon, is Soto. Studies have found that Asian Americans were more accurate than European Americans in identifying the emotions experienced by their close friends. European Americans were more accurate than Asian Americans in identifying the emotions that were experienced by strangers. And this was research done by Mock Helms and Blaskovich in 2012. So Asian Americans, because they are closer, because they have a more collectivist mindset, they're able to identify people in their in-group, that because those people are important, but not their Soto, the out-groups. They don't really pay attention to those people, so they have a difficult time identifying their emotions. But European Americans are more tangential with everything, so they had a more difficult time identifying people that were supposed to be in their in-group, but it was easier for them to identify the emotions of people in their out-group. In places like Japan, where commitment to in-group members is strong, there should be less of a willingness to cooperate with outgoing members. People with interdependent selves focus their trust on people they share some kind of relationship. Yamagishi and Yamagishi in 1994 found that Americans tend to have higher levels of general trust than the Japanese do. It's really kind of weird because no matter where you go in the world, people will say the Americans are such friendly people. Why? Well, we maintain more tangential relationships with people, and it's easier for us to be friends with people. And in more collectivist countries and with a more collectivist mindset, you have in groups and out groups, and the in group you're real close to, but the out group you're not very close to. But Americans, we don't have that distinction. We see all people as our friends, as weird as that seems, and it's because we're individualists and we move around. Or it's not because they move around a lot. It's because we have a different way of looking at the world from an individualist point of view. Bond and Smith in 1996 found that people with more interdependent views of self are more likely to conform than those with more independent views. This may be because people with more interdependent selves view in-group members as an extension of themselves while maintaining distance from out-group members. Now, this is really kind of an interesting picture because this is a picture that was made of an American. The United States are the one. Japan used to be a closed society. They wouldn't allow anybody to land on the islands of Japan. If you did, they killed you. But the American Navy came in and they forced the Japanese to open their ports. And this is a picture of an American drawn by a Japanese person. And as you can see, he looks like kind of a hairy monster with a long nose. Look how long his nose is. Japanese, a lot of Japanese look alike. Well, they look very similar to one another. Americans, they look like, well, they don't look alike. I I don't think I look like that. My lips aren't that red, for one thing. My nose isn't quite that long, and I have blue eyes instead of brown. But that's not important. In 1983, IBM tasked psychologist Gert Hofstede to assess their employees' opinions and interests. Now, the interesting thing about Gert Hofstede is he's from Holland, and he was hired by IBM, which is an American company, to do this study. Hofstede administered questionnaires to 117,000 employees in 40 different countries. Hofstede was able to map the individualism of all the employees in each country. The country scores show a clear and striking pattern. Hofstede discovered that the most individualistic country in the world is the United States, closely followed by other English-speaking countries and by Western European nations. Countries that scored high in collectivism were various nations in Latin America and Asia. Other research has found similar results, and the reason I'm showing you this picture is because this is Kim Kardashian taking a selfie. And she's the one that popularized selfies, as weird as that sounds. Collectivism has been found to dominate in Asia, Africa, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and the South Pacific. Most people participate in collectivistic cultures where interdependent selves are more common. These countries encompass more than 80% of the world's population, and these are the countries that are more collectivistic. And as you can see, it's Mexico, Central America, South America, Africa, Southern Europe, not Northern Europe or Central Europe, and there's the Scandinavian countries, that's Iceland, Australia, and New Zealand. All the rest of the countries in the world, in Asia, Africa, South America, Central America, they are more collectivistic. The state with the highest collectivism score by far was Hawaii, probably because of the state's large population of people with Asian ancestry. The next most collectivistic states were Utah and the states of the Confederate South. So what are the states of the Confederate South? We'll start with Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, and Arkansas. Those are the Confederate South. The least collectivistic states were in the Mountain West, the Great Plains, and the Northeast, and the Midwest. Individualism varies as a function of social class. Specifically, this is a picture of Alaska. This is Diamond Head right there. That's what Diamond Head looks like. This is the Mauna Loa, the pink hotel on the Waikiki Beach. This is Waikiki. All the way around here is Waikiki Beach. Individualism varies as a function of social class. Specifically, people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have more independent selves than those from poorer backgrounds within the same country. Wealthier Icelandic children tend to describe themselves more in terms of inner psychological traits than poor Icelandic children do. Middle-class American parents emphasize the importance of self-direction to their children, whereas working-class American parents place greater value on conforming to authority figures. And this is according to Weininger and Leroux in 2009. Middle-class Americans. Interdependent messages are a better fit with American students from a working-class background. Some of the highest concentrations of universities in the United States are in the Northeast and the Midwest, where individualism is more pronounced. Psychological research within the United States has been largely conducted with participants who are even more individualistic than most other Americans. And this is really kind of interesting, because if you look at Division III schools, and Division III schools are small schools that don't give athletic scholarships. That's all Division III means. And if you look at all the Division III schools, they're almost all of them in the Northeast, New York, Pennsylvania, Maine, Connecticut, um, down into well, that's about it. Maryland has some. Ohio has a ton. So does Indiana. So does Michigan. So does Illinois, Wisconsin. And the farther west you go, the fewer of these schools there are. The fewer Division III schools, as weird as that sounds. An example is if you live in New Mexico, I think there's one in New Mexico. No, there's none in New Mexico. There's none in New Mexico and none in Arizona. And there's only like 4 or 5 in California, 2 in Oregon, and 3 in Washington State. But if you go to Indiana, you can, there's just a ton in Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, just a ton of these small colleges. Why? Because there's so many middle class people that live in those states. There's also a lot of working class people living in those states, but there's also that's where the middle class mindset was established in the Northeast and the Midwest. Other cultural dimensions that researchers have investigated include societal tightness versus looseness. Societal tightness characterizes how strong cultural norms are and how tolerant cultures are of deviant behavior. This predicts level of prevention, focus, impulse control, and self-regulation. Another cultural dimension that has been investigated are cultural values. Values for universalism, benevolence, conformity, tradition, security, power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, self-direction. Other cultural dimensions that have been investigated: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, vertical horizontal social structure, relationship structure, context dependence, social cynicism, complexity. One of the difficulties in studying cultural psychology is that individuals tend to be varied and complex. Cultures are highly variable and are resistant to categorization. All cultures are highly heterogeneous and contain a great variety of people. Cultural differences, this book describes, reflect general patterns of differences and not all or nothing statements. You can't make all or nothing statements. There are no absolutes in cultural psychology. A number of researchers have identified women as more interdependent than men. The features of independent entities seem more characteristic of men than of women. There are issues of gender equality in most cultures. Women represent only about 3% of elected officials in Arab nations. Women represent 45% of the Swedish parliament. In Brazil, 50% of the men and women are literate. That means they can read. In Pakistan, twice as many men are literate as women. In the Netherlands, Germany, and Finland, on the average, people expressed views that men and women should be treated quite similarly. In India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, people tended to believe that roles, obligations, and rights of men and women are clearly different, with men being perceived to have more rights than women. Within a culture, men and women tended to share fairly similar views about gender equality. In India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, women tended to embrace the gender attitudes of their respective countries. In every case, except we've got haze here from the fire, so it smells like smoke outside. In every case, except 2 reversals in Malaysia and Pakistan, males have a significantly more traditional gender view than females, probably because traditional gender views benefit men more than women. And this is an old Van Heusen Thai advertisement from the 1950s. And as you can see, the woman's on her knees feeding her husband breakfast in bed, and he's dressed with a shirt and tie, which is kind of stupid for being in bed. Show her it's a man's world. All right, it's a Van Heusen man's world, of course. Countries in which a large percentage of the population practiced Christianity, in particular Protestantism, were more likely to have egalitarian gender views, whereas countries with a large percentage of Muslims were associated with a more traditional gender view. Oddly, more northern countries express more egalitarian views, and more southern countries express more traditional gender views. The more urbanized the country, the more likely the country will have egalitarian views. A country's individualism score correlated positively with egalitarian views. One way to look at gender and culture is to determine which gender identity is viewed to be more essentialized, which gender is thought to reflect an underlying unchangeable essence, which gender has less flexible ways of being expressed in a socially approved way. Americans tend to view male gender identity to be more essentialized than female gender identity. Most Americans do not seem to find it disturbing or unusual for women to present themselves like men, wearing pants, having short hair, not wearing facial makeup, or participating in stereotypical male behaviors, girls playing with trucks or girls playing ice hockey. Now, just how weird does this look? This man wearing a dress. Which looks stranger, this woman playing ice hockey or this man wearing a dress? Many Americans do find it disturbing or unusual for men to present themselves as women, wearing dresses, high heels, or lipstick, or to participate in stereotypically female behaviors, playing with dolls or taking ballet lessons. Male identity is less changeable and thus more essentialized. In Hindu myths, many more male gods change into female goddesses than female goddesses change into gods. The Hindu religion involves goddess worship, and many of the most powerful gods are female: Kali, Parvati, Durga, and Maya. According to the Hindu religion, female identity is viewed as pure, strong, and powerful. In India, the male gender identity was more mutable and less essentialized than the female gender. This is Kali. This is Parvati. Parvati and her elephant. Kali and her tiger. Durga and her lion. And Maya and her elephant. And if you notice, they've all got many arms. Maya has 4. Durga has 6, 7, 8. I guess she's got 8. Parvati has 4. And Kali has 8. This is actually Kali. She's got 10, doesn't she? Anyway. Festinger in 1957 proposed that people have a powerful motivation to be consistent, and their cognitive dissonance is the distressing feeling we have when we observe ourselves acting inconsistently. The belief that we can easily change and are expected to change is referred to as an incremental theory of self. Traits are malleable and can be improved. Aspects of the self are largely resistant to change, which is known as an entity theory of self. Individuals with this view see their attributes to be largely inborn, written in stone. The entity and incremental self theories of intelligence. One sees his intelligence as written in stone, and the other is that it can change over time. Research found that 60% of Chinese high school students said that the key to success in math is to study hard. In contrast, less than 25% of American high school students felt this way. Japanese believe more than Americans that intelligence is based on how hard you try rather than on what you are born with. To get into a good American university, you typically need to get an acceptable score on the SAT. The SAT was originally designed to measure innate aptitudes and not efforts in one's classes. It turns out that studying hard can increase one's SAT score significantly. This has been a source of frustration for test makers because the tests are no longer serving the function they were originally designed for, which has sparked much policy debate about their utility. IQ tests are regularly given in public schools in the United States, and the results influence decisions on whether students should attend gifted or remedial classes. In Japan, to get into a good university, you need to do well on university entrance exams that test your mastery of a large amount of material. The Japanese bar exam to become a lawyer is notoriously difficult. Only 2.5% of people pass it every year, and those who do on average have failed the exam 4 times before ultimately succeeding. Approximately 2/3 of those taking the American bar exam each year pass it, with about 3/4 of them passing it on their first attempt. The 5-factor model of personality started as a personality profile test developed to test U.S. Air Force officers in the 1950s by Tupes and Crystal in 1961. And this is a picture of Tupes, I think. Tupes and Crystal used factor analysis to determine which of Cattell's 16 personality factors were significant. They came up with 5 that factored as most important over and over again. And this is Cattell's 16 personality factors: warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension. And these are the 5 factors that they discovered, Tupes and Crystal. Openness to experience reflects a person's intelligence and curiosity about the world. Conscientiousness indicates how responsible and dependable an individual is. Extroversion indicates how much an individual is active and dominant. Agreeableness is the extent to which a person tends to be warm and pleasant. Neuroticism is the degree to which an individual can be seen as emotionally stable and unpredictable. The 5-factor model proposes that all personality traits largely reflect some combination of these 5 core traits. All personality traits should show significant correlations with at least one, if not more, of these core traits. The 5 factors can be seen to reflect the basic structure of personality. There is a question as to how well the 5-factor structure generalizes elsewhere. Now remember, this was developed as a test to determine if somebody would make a good Air Force officer. Now, the difference between the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines and the Army is that the Air Force, their officers are primarily either pilots or they are ancillary personnel that support the pilots. So the idea is not to boss people around as much as to create an atmosphere where things can get done. Now, this is a little bit different than the Army, where people have to lead people constantly, where you're constantly maintaining control over a lot of individuals. In the Air Force, there's a lot of times when you're not being observed by anybody. You have to do the right thing. So the Air Force officer is a little bit different than the Army and Navy officers, who are leading a large group of men. Pilots, for example, probably don't order anybody around. They don't have to because their only job is to fly. In the Navy and Army, of course, and in the Marines, you have to control all of these men. So it's just a little bit different. So let's look at these 5 factors and see how they fit into the mission of the United States Air Force. Openness to experience, it reflects intelligence and curiosity about the world. So they need to be knowledgeable about things to be able to accumulate information, new information. If you're a pilot, if you're somebody who's never flown before and you're taking pilot training, it's really important that you're smart enough to figure out how to fly that airplane. Conscientiousness indicates how responsible and dependable an individual is, and of course, that's also important as far as being able to fly that airplane. This is a multi-million-dollar airframe that you are responsible for. If you are controlling people, you're controlling people to keep that airplane in the air. So conscientiousness is extremely important. Extroversion indicates how much an individual is active and dominant, and of course that has to do with leadership. Agreeableness is the extent to which a person tends to be warm and pleasant. Now, why in the world would agreeableness be important to the Air Force and not important to the other branches of the service? The other branches of the service don't really care if somebody likes you, but in the Air Force, it is a more open society. It's a more open military structure. And because of that, and because people are doing things without supervision a lot, or potentially, then the officer needs to gain the respect of the enlisted personnel. That's important. So warmth and pleasantness is important to the Air Force, where it may not be important to the Navy and the Army and the Marines, where you've got to tell people to go fight and die. Doesn't usually, it's not that extreme in the Air Force. Neuroticism is the degree to which an individual can be seen as emotionally stable and unpredictable. Neuroticism would be a negative thing, and it's something that they need to be careful of. Neuroticism, whereas being a little crazy in the Army and the Navy and the Marines, not nearly as serious as being responsible for an airframe or being responsible to maintain that airframe or that person. Okay, so there you go. An analysis of indigenous Chinese personality trait terms found a set of factors that were not the same as the Big Five. Rather, 4 factors emerged that were captured by the following labels. Dependability. Now remember, we're talking about individualism, and we're also talking about collectivism. So the Chinese are collectivists. And because they're collectivists, they're going to have different, the 5 factors that are most important in their lives are going to be different. Dependability, reflecting responsibility, optimism, and trustworthiness, and that, of course, has to do with their collectivism. Interpersonal relatedness, reflecting harmony, thrift, relational orientation, and tradition. Once again, a very potent collectivist trait. Social potency, reflecting leadership, adventurousness, and extroversion. And individualism, reflecting logical orientation, defensiveness, and self-orientation. Similar approaches have been taken in other cultures. Researchers looking at Filipino personality traits discovered 2 additional traits to the Big Five: temperamentalness and a negative valence dimension. Negative valence dimension means when you confront a problem that you get angry about it. And that's kind of what temperamentalness means as well. So in the Philippines, which is actually an Asian country, being able to control other individuals has to do with getting angry with people. Whereas in the United States, you get angry with people, people do not do their job. But in the Philippines, in Asia, this is an important aspect. In an investigation of 11 different language groups in South Africa revealed 9 underlying factors, some of which overlapped with the Big Five, but other factors that did not. Integrity and relationship harmony. Those were important in South Africa. Some studies in other languages reveal evidence for factors in addition to the Big Five. Other studies sometimes do not find evidence for all five of the Big Five traits. In particular, openness to experience is the trait that emerges the least consistently in studies conducted in other languages. And this may be because people in other countries have lived there ancestrally for an extended length of time. They maybe have been there for thousands of years. And this, of course, is the flag of Romania. I'm not sure why I put the Romanian flag in there. North Central Great Plains, especially around Minnesota and Wisconsin, is the epicenter for the friendly and conventional cluster, as residents are the highest in the country for the traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. So if you want to be around friendly people, there it is. And of course, I live here, right below Wisconsin. That's where I live. The western states, from Oregon down to Arizona, house the relaxed and creative cluster, where there is the lowest neuroticism and the highest openness to experience. The northeastern states, especially New York and Massachusetts, are home to the temperamental and uninhibited cluster, where people score the highest on neuroticism and the lowest on conscientiousness. What are we talking about? We're talking about grouchy people. And my student that I'm discussing things with from time to time, the one from Bangladesh, he's in Salem, Massachusetts, which is just north of Boston, and he's finding that the people aren't very nice, and that may have something to do with the fact that it's the Northeast. He's trying to move back toward Iowa. He went to Ashford University in Clinton, which is right here. Right now, he's got a job offer right below Indianapolis and Franklin, and one in Ohio. So he's trying to get a little bit closer to people that are a little bit friendlier. Now, he went to college and he got his master's and PhD in Dayton, which is about 70 miles east of the Indiana border. So we'll see. He might be better off taking the job in Indiana since people are a little bit friendlier there than Ohio. And that's the end of that chapter. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. And we'll get on to chapter 7. Multicultural, living in a multicultural world. Acculturation is the process by which people migrate to and learn a culture that is different from their original or heritage culture. That's known as acculturation. It's not a negative thing. Moving to a new culture involves psychological adjustment. This adjustment occurs over a wide variety of domains, acquiring a new language, learning new interpersonal and social behaviors, becoming accustomed to new values, becoming a member of a minority group, adjusting one's self-concept. Really kind of interesting living on the Navajo Nation because I was a minority. Now, I've been a minority before. I've lived in black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods. I lived close to the reservation in Montana. And I've lived in Japan and Germany, where I certainly was a minority in both those places. So it wasn't that much of a change, but it was a little bit different. Yeah, well, we'll talk about that later. Lisgard in 1955 tracked a number of Norwegian Fulbright scholars in the United States. In the first few months of their experiences, the migrants were having an especially positive time in their visit. The first few months, they were having a great time. They were enjoying the experiences, meeting new people, trying new foods, communicating with people in a foreign language, and feeling the excitement of participating in a novel and exotic environment, the United States. Oberg in 1960 referred to the first few months as the honeymoon stage. It is the existence of the honeymoon stage that keeps tourism trade in business. Why? Because if you go visit a country, usually you don't spend more than a couple weeks there, and you're still in the honeymoon phase, and you're learning all this new stuff, and you're seeing new things. It's great. Most travelers do not stay in a new culture long enough to move past this stage, and they thus tend to view their experiences in new cultures to be, for the most part, pleasant and exciting. I had a friend that I worked for a doctor who worked for Doctors Without Borders sometimes, and he would take his vacations helping people around the world. He was a pediatrician. And one time he went to Ukraine, and I asked him about it after he came back, and he had a great time. He always has a great time, no matter where he goes. People are so friendly every place in the world. And of course, I told him, well, if you had lived there, maybe things would have changed a little bit. And he said, no, I'm so intelligent that I can embrace a culture no matter how long I've been there. And I said, have you ever been any place longer than a couple months? And he said, no. He never visited any place, and he liked every place he'd ever been. Well, there's a reason for that. He was always in the honeymoon stage. It's kind of like getting married and going on your honeymoon and just keep getting married and going on your honeymoon. You think marriage is just the most wonderful thing in the world because you've never spent more than a couple of weeks with the same person. Following the honeymoon stage, most visitors turn a corner and begin to have increasingly negative views about their host culture. And this is according to Lysgaard in 1955. Between the 6 and 18-month visitors experienced the most negative feelings of their sojourn in a stage that has been labeled the crisis or culture shock stage. And of course, I've lived in Germany, I lived in Japan, and of course, culture shock starts real early in Japan. But in Germany, it wasn't so bad. You get to the point where it gets real irritating after about 6 months there. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of military members they don't spend any time on the economy in Germany or wherever they are. And the reason is because it's a hostile alien environment, or it feels that way. In the culture shock stage, the thrill of having novel and exotic experiences wears off, and these experiences become tiring and difficult. At this stage, recent migrants often realize their language skills are not yet good enough for them to fully function in the new environment. During the culture shock stage, the migrant realizes that they do not have a rich enough understanding of how the system works to thrive. The people they initially met who were interested in them because they were exotic and different are no longer so interested in these differences. Recent migrants may also be discovering that the television programs just aren't as interesting as the ones they used to see in their home country, and they start to miss their favorite foods. This is the time that homesickness can become very strong. Culture shock is the feeling of being anxious, helpless, irritable, and in general homesick that one experiences after moving to a new culture. The symptoms of culture shock includes missing your close friends and family, missing the little things about being back home, like conversations with bus drivers, eating your favorite snack. A sojourner in a culture shock may wallow in the crisis stage for several months and then start to adjust and begin to enjoy their experiences more. Their language abilities improve, enabling them to function better in their daily lives. Eventually, sojourners become better able to make enduring friendships with the locals, and they adapt to things in the new culture, such as the TV programming and the food, so that these no longer felt strange. They have started thinking more and more like the locals around them. This stage, labeled the adjustment phase, tends to extend over a number of years. People become more and more proficient at functioning in their new culture. Now, this is true of just about any place that you can go, except the more hostile the environment, the longer it takes to get into the sojourner stage. And there you go. This guy is so imbued with his new environment that he's dressing like a local. Well, they've all got shorts on. Oh, there she is. Which one of these people doesn't belong? It's probably the lady with a brassiere on. And these three women have none. Okay. Which of these people don't belong? This is really kind of funny because look at some of the looks that this lady's getting. From him. She's not real happy. She's wandering around without a shirt on. Sojourners may go through the same adjustment stages when they return home. Initially, people are elated to see their families and friends again and to be able to eat their favorite foods. It is not uncommon for people to soon experience reverse culture shock and find themselves puzzling over why they did not quite feel at home anymore and why they feel somewhat alienated from those around them. They don't feel like they are a good fit anymore. And of course, if you've ever been overseas, then you know that this happens. This happens, and your vocabulary has changed. Your food choices have changed. I can remember missing German food when I came back to the States because American food isn't quite as well prepared as it is in Germany. Too many fast foods in the United States. Okay, now this may be true for every place except in Japan. Japan is a country that is relatively ethnically homogenous. 98% of the people living in Japan are Japanese. Regardless of how well people learn the customs or master the language, they will always stand out as different from the other 98% who are ethnically Japanese. Cao Ying in 1995 tracked the acculturation experiences of a few hundred migrants to Japan, but didn't find the pattern that Leisgard had seen in 1955. Instead of a U-shaped curve where things start out great, get worse, and then recover, the researchers discovered a rather pessimistic L-shaped curve where things stay bad. Cao Ying in 1995 discovered that people who had been in Japan for 5 years were just as negative toward Japan as those who had been there for just over a year. They all seemed in the depths of the crisis stage. The author speculates that the adjustment phase starts somewhere around after 5, but before the 10-year period. Now, the question is, why the hell are you staying there if it's so miserable? Cultural distance is the difference between cultures and their overall ways of life. We can hypothesize that the more cultural distance someone needs to travel, the more difficulty the person will have acculturating. There are various measures that can be used to determine acculturation across cultures. One indirect measure is language performance. Several studies show that the best predictors of acculturative success is language ability, and there are two studies that say this, Gullahorn in 1963, and then Ying and Lisi in 1991. This is a symbol for Japan, by the way. This thing and this thing. Knowles and colleagues in 1996 speculated that the greater the confidence in the mastery of the host country's language, the greater the identity with the culture. A lot of people think that people are talking about them, and you know, a lot of times they are because you're so much different than everybody else. But a lot of people don't like to be talked about, and they think that they're saying negative things about them. Many researchers have found a connection between language skills and success acculturating. When foreign students seek entry into the United States universities, they are required to take the TOEFL, the test of English as a foreign language. Research shows that individuals who come from countries that are similar to English, Dutch and German, perform better than those who grew up speaking other European languages that are a little more distant, Romance languages such as French and Spanish. This is a lady from Holland, you can tell because of the orange, and this is a lady from Germany because you can tell from the word on her chest. Her shirt. According to the Educational Testing Service, which administers the TOEFL, speakers of Indo-European languages tend to perform better on the TOEFL than those who speak languages from highly distant language groups such as Kazakhstan and the Japanese. Cultural distance encapsulates more than just language. Many other skills must be mastered when people move to a new culture. Ward and Kennedy in 1995 compared the adjustment of Malaysian university students in New Zealand, a culture that is quite different from their own despite the not so distant proximity, and a group of Malaysian students in Singapore, a similar culture. And this is Singapore, this is Malaysia right here, and Singapore is right here, and this is New Zealand right there. The students completed a measure of cultural adjustment that assessed their daily problems in navigating through the new culture. After spending almost 3 years in the two countries, the Malaysian students who were studying in Singapore reported having fewer difficulties than those who were studying in New Zealand. Singapore, right at the end of the Malaysian peninsula. Sojourners from more distant cultures suffer from more distress, require more medical consultations, and have more social difficulties in general than those who traverse less cultural distances. That's according to Babaker et al. In 1980 and Furnham and Bachner in 1982. Some indigenous Canadian tribes, such as the Tsimshian of the Northwest Pacific Coast region, engaged in subsistence practices, primarily fishing for salmon and shellfish, that allowed them to accumulate large quantities of food and establish permanent, highly stratified settlements long before they had any contact with Europeans. The Eastern Cree lived just below the tree line in northern Quebec. They engage in subsistence practices, hunting in the winter and fishing in the summer, which does not allow them to accumulate much food. So some of the bands are migratory and have low sociocultural stratification. The Carrier, an Atashima and Athapascan speaking group, live on the Rocky Mountain Plateau of northern British Columbia, also engage in hunting and fishing like the Eastern Cree. But because they have the possibility of accumulating large numbers of salmon at the headwaters of some rivers, and because their culture was influenced geographically close to the Tsimshian, the Carrier represent a culture with a moderate degree of food accumulation and social stratification. Barry and Annis in 1974 speculated that the more stratified the culture, the more similar they were to the European culture, the easier it would be to acculturate to a European dominance. The Tsimshian acculturated the easiest, the Eastern Cree had the most stress in acculturating, and Carrier were somewhere in between. Cultural fit is the degree to which an individual's personality is more similar to the dominant cultural values in the host culture. It would seem that the greater the cultural fit of a person with the host culture, the more easily he or she should acculturate to it. And I have this is another Canadian First Nation person. In his power regalia, so is this. Fancy dancers. People who score high on extroversion are more likely to move to other countries, particularly to urban areas, when compared with those who are less extroverted. Some researchers have proposed that because extroversion should facilitate communication everywhere, extroverts should always fare better in the acculturation experience compared with introverts. The study in New Zealand found that Malaysians high on the extroversion scale showed more signs of well-being than those who scored low. However, English-speaking expatriates in Singapore who scored high on the extroversion scale reported more depression, boredom, frustration, and health problems. Extroversion does not always facilitate acculturation. It appears that an extroverted personality makes a better cultural fit in New Zealand than it does in Singapore, and extroverts will fare better in the acculturation experience only when they fit in well with the culture. Not like her. Highly extroverted immigrants fare better in terms of their well-being when they immigrate to countries with overall more pronounced levels of extroversion. people with more independent self-concepts have been found to suffer less distress in acculturating to the U.S. than people with more interdependent self-concepts. And people who have patterns of emotions that are more similar to those from the host culture report experiencing greater relational well-being. One acculturation strategy is that people need to participate in the larger society of their host culture. Are the people motivated to acquire an identity consistent with that of the host culture? Are these people striving to maintain their own heritage culture and identity as members of that culture? Do people have positive attitudes toward their heritage culture, and are they actively seeking ways to preserve the traditions of their heritage culture? Another strategy of acculturation involves attempts to fully participate in the host culture, while at the same time striving to maintain the traditions of one's heritage culture. This is known as integration strategy. People using this strategy have positive views toward both their heritage and their host culture. They are seeking the best of both worlds. The strategy that involves little or no effort to participate in the host culture or to maintain the traditions of the heritage culture is known as the marginalization strategy. People using this strategy have negative views toward both their heritage and the host culture. This strategy may be something pursued more by people who have grown up in multiple cultures across their childhood. Some individuals who have grown up in multiple cultures are sometimes termed as third culture kids, and thus will identify themselves as global citizens. Some researchers do not accept marginalization as a legitimate acculturation strategy, but as a form of neuroticism. The assimilation strategy involves an attempt to fit in and fully participate in the host culture while making little or no effort to maintain the traditions of one's heritage culture. It involves having positive attitudes toward the heritage culture. It reflects a desire to leave behind the ancestral past so as to fit in with the host culture. The separation strategy involves efforts to maintain the traditions of the heritage culture while making little or no effort to participate in the host culture. This strategy is composed of positive attitudes toward the heritage culture and negative attitudes toward the host culture. People pursuing separation strategies do not wish to acculturate to the host culture. The most common strategy people pursue is the integration strategy. The least common strategy is the marginalization strategy. A person will not strive to fit into the host culture if that culture shows a good deal of prejudice toward the individual's own cultural group. People who have physical features that distinguish them from the majority of those in their host culture will likely experience more prejudice than people who have physical features that allow them to blend in with their host culture. More physically distinct ethnic groups are more likely to maintain negative attitudes toward the host culture and pursue separation or marginalization strategies. Physically distinct ethnic groups are more likely to actively support collective efforts to benefit their group's social position. People who are of low socioeconomic status or who are members of indigenous cultural groups are more likely to pursue separation or marginalization strategies because the host culture does not typically offer them much that they desire. The extent to which majority members of the host culture value cultural diversity and tolerance of cultural differences also predicts the amount of prejudice that immigrants experience. When host cultures promote tolerance for diversity and multiculturalism, migrants are more likely to adopt more positive attitudes toward the host culture, which increases the likelihood that they will pursue integration or assimilation strategies. The acculturation strategy that one adopts might vary across situations. Turkish immigrants in the Netherlands often show an integration strategy in public situations, whereas they act in the mainstream of Dutch ways. Yet some will simultaneously show a separation strategy in private, rejecting mainstream Dutch ways when they are in an entirely Turkish immigrant setting. And this is according to Ranstoff and Van de Veer in 2003. Now, if you look at this picture, I can tell you that two of these individuals are of Turkish descent, and the rest of the individuals are Dutch. And if you guessed the two ladies with the black hair, you would be absolutely correct. The four acculturation strategies, assimilation, integration, separation, and marginalization, are hypothesized to yield different outcomes in the acculturation process. The strategy that is hypothesized to result in the lowest degree of acculturative stress is the integration strategy, and much research shows that this strategy yields the most favorable outcomes. Sometimes immigrants will adopt the fast food eating habits of Americans. Among immigrants who have lived in the United States for less than a year, 8% were obese. Among those who had been here for 15 years, 19% were obese. The percentage approaches the obesity rate for American-born residents at 22%. When an immigrant or minority member does not fit the prototype of their host culture, people might question their identity. This is called identity denial. Their identity is called into question because they do not seem to match the prototype of the culture. And this individual, this is James Franco. James Franco is Portuguese and Russian. His mother's Russian, Jewish, and Dutch, I think. And this is Halle Berry. Her mother is Italian and her father is African American. And some people say she doesn't have enough African American features to be considered African American. Some people think that James Franco is a little dark for somebody who's supposed to be white, but that's his Portuguese ancestry. In 1992, Steele identified a phenomenon that had puzzled psychometricians for decades. What was causing highly qualified African American students to do worse in their studies? Steele's hypothesis is referred to as stereotype threat, the fear that one might do something that will inadvertently confirm a negative stereotype about one's group. After achieving acculturation, an immigrant becomes bicultural. The tendency for bicultural people to evince psychological tendencies between those of their two cultures is called blending. The individual tends to switch between different cultural selves in a process known as frame switching or alternation. And you guys may be able to identify with this living on the Navajo Nation or being Navajo, and also living in and around the dominant white culture in the United States. Inner city children, especially minorities, quickly learn to discriminate between the norms and unwritten rules that govern their schools and mainstream society and those that govern the streets. Code switching is an essential skill for inner city children to learn if they are to survive and succeed in these two divergent cultural contexts. Anderson in 1999 argues that such children must learn to switch between the code of the decent and code of the street as they deal with people in their school culture and their street culture. The code of the street permeates many aspects of life, in particular the development of a reputation that one is tough and is not to be messed with. Multiculturals engage in frame switching through the language that they speak. The language that people speak seems to activate an associated cultural network, and this influences how they think. When bilinguals switch between languages, they are not just bringing different vocabularies and grammars to mind, they seem to be bringing different selves to mind as well. Researchers found that people who had lived in more than one culture were more likely to come up with outside-the-box creative solutions to problems than those who had lived in only one culture, and that's according to Maddox and Gilinski in 2009. Maddox and Galinsky further found that those who had merely visited other cultures as tourists did not show any comparative creativity advantage. Visiting other cultures is quite different from living in another culture because the former does not involve any adjustment on the part of the individual. Adjusting to life in a new culture is more likely to provide one with an additional perspective, and this appears to be associated with enhanced creativity. One reason that multicultural experiences foster creative thinking is that living in different cultures fosters a way of thinking called integrative complexity, a willingness and ability to acknowledge and consider different viewpoints on the same issue. And that is the end of the chapter. That is the end of the lecture. So I'll talk to you guys next week.